Hello YouTube, and welcome to my channel. My name is Benedict the 17th, and this video is a follow-up to a stream I did with Royal Endeavor, Cedarwood, Zarathustra's Serpent, and Brandon. First of all, I want to thank Royal Endeavor for having me on. It was a great conversation and a lot of great points were brought up. At the end of the stream, the participants seemed to agree that the biggest distinction between the alt-right and the liberalists is their respective positions on identity politics, and that a future stream should concentrate on that issue. This video can thus be seen as a follow-up to the stream that we had and a preparation for a future one. Before I get into my objection to identity politics, I think it's worth touching on something that has come up in a number of conversations with alt-right or traditionalist personalities. Liberalists are not consequentialists. That is to say, we are liberalists not because we think following the liberalist principles will bring about the best outcome for society, although we do. Rather, we follow the principles because we believe they are intrinsically good, and not adhering to them is intrinsically wrong. That is to say, even if the worst predictions of the alt-right are true, and liberalism will cause the death of Western civilizations, that doesn't show that those in favor of Western civilization should not be liberalists. In fact, as a big fan of Western civilization, my rejoinder would be that if Western civilization is forced to give up her soul by abandoning the principles that made her what she is in order to survive, then she has been given a fate worse than death. It would be better to give her a noble death than a haunted half-life. To argue that Western civilization ought to become illiberal in order to survive is to make the same argument that Saruman made to Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, or that Caiaphas made to Christ, that one can justify evil actions with moral ends. But this is the same kind of thinking that Western civilization has rejected time and time again. From Christ to Immanuel Kant, the history of Western civilization is bound up with the notion that it is better to suffer injustice than to commit it. This places the liberalists on the side of Socrates, of Christ, of Churchill, and the alt-right on the side of Thrasymachus, of Pilate, and of Marx. Our conflict is therefore not just political, but cultural, and even more than that, spiritual. This is what I will address in this video on identity politics, but I just wanted to make that point very clear. Insofar as liberalists promote the objective natural law claims for liberalist principles, and the alt-right defend their position by resorting to consequentialism, it's the liberalists that are the real traditionalists. When liberalists object to the use of identity politics, the reactions from alt-right circles seem to suggest that they think liberalists do so because of the first word, identity. But this is not the case. Liberalists don't object to people identifying with a particular identity, and in fact all of us do. It's actually the second word we object to, identity politics. The problem with identity politics is that the goal of identity politics is to use the political order to achieve the goals of members of that identity group. But the political order is not meant to be used to further the ends of any group. Our contention with the alt-right, therefore, is not that identifying with an identity is wrong, but that using the coercive power of the state to further the ends of that identity group is a violation of natural law. The reasoning is as follows. Politics can be said to be an art or science. As Aristotle says, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has rightly been declared to be that which all things aim. So while all arts aim at the good, in a universal sense, the good is differentiated in the actual operation of those arts. G.K. Chesterton also noted that there are different goods and different senses of the word good when he said, "If a man were to shoot his grandmother at a range of 500 yards, I should call him a good shot, but not necessarily a good man." So politics, just like every other art, must exist for some good. Now, the arts are differentiated by their objects, so just like horsemanship is ordered toward the good of horses, and medicine is ordered toward the good of the body, so politics must have its own good that distinguishes it from other arts. Thus, to understand the liberalist objection to identity politics, we must first ask, what is the good of politics? Now, Aristotle tells us the end or goal of politics is the best of ends, and the main concern of politics is to engender a certain character in its citizens and make them good and disposed to perform noble actions. Now, surely the good of a human being is the possessing of those qualities that make him most human, just as we would call a horse good based on how it resembles the form of a horse, or we would call a ship good based on its ship-like qualities, we would call a human being good based on its human-like qualities. And what are those qualities? Well, the virtues. Surely we call a man a good man in virtue of his temperance, fortitude, wisdom, and justice, faith, hope, and charity. Given the above, it's clear that the purpose of the state is to adopt policies that would make people temperate, courageous, wise, and just. But we run into two problems here. The first is the agent relativity of the virtues. By this I mean that while the virtues themselves may be universal, the way they are expressed in individual human beings' lives are not. A doctor and a soldier both need to be courageous, but the kind of courage they need is qualitatively different. A professor and a business owner both need wisdom and prudence, but in different ways. This extends beyond one's profession as well. A bachelor and a married man both need temperance, but the way temperance is expressed in the single life and the married life is qualitatively different. A devoted Catholic and an atheist both need the virtue of faith, but the way in which they both need to grow in faith is qualitatively different. This is important to understand because it's clear that if we want our state to encourage the development of virtue in individuals, it's not as simple as saying that all people need to be courageous or prudent. We would need to make sure our state is encouraging the right kind of virtue as is proper to someone's station in life. The state must give the doctor the courage of the doctor and not the courage of the soldier. The single man must be given the chastity of the single man and not the chastity of the married man. The atheist must be given the faith appropriate to his station in life and not the faith appropriate to a long-time devotee. But this practical problem, as serious as it is not half as serious as the following one, which is central to the nature of the virtues themselves. The second problem is that the state cannot infuse virtues, for virtues reside in will, and the political order cannot, by imposing its own will on a citizen, increase the will of that citizen. As Thomas Aquinas says, every power which may be variously directed to act needs a habit, whereby it is well disposed to its act. Now, since the will is a rational power, it may be variously directed to act, and therefore in the will we must admit the presence of habit whereby it is well disposed to its act. Moreover, from the very nature of habit, it is clear that it is principally related to the will, inasmuch as habit is that which one uses when one wills. This is obvious when we consider examples. The state may force a person to undertake a certain courageous action, by, for example, drafting him to fight in a war, but if the person only goes out of compulsion and not by an act of will, then the person has not acted virtuously, and cannot be said to be courageous. Similarly, one is not called charitable for paying taxes, even if that tax money goes to charitable causes. Thus, if the role of the political order is ordered toward the virtue of its citizens, but the state cannot by itself infuse the virtues themselves, then is there at least some part of the virtues that the state can guarantee? Yes, every virtue can be said to be divided into two parts. We may call them the form and matter of the virtue. The form is the character the virtue takes and is what differentiates the virtues from one another. It's what makes courage courage and not prudence, for example. The matter can be said to be the individual's will to perform acts of that virtue. Now, the state cannot provide the form for the reason of the agent relativity of virtues, nor can it provide the matter, since the state cannot force people to will virtuous things. What the state can do is that it can allow moral agents the moral space by which they themselves can choose to take virtuous actions. By enforcing the natural right of its citizens, through the implementation of laws which maximize every citizen's ability to choose, the state creates the greatest possibility for virtue. Now, this does not mean that every citizen will use that freedom to actually be virtuous. A man given the opportunity to be temperate may choose to be gluttonous, but it is not the role of the state to step in and prevent him from doing so. If the state did, then the man would be choosing not to indulge out of fear and not out of virtue. There are other social and cultural institutions, like the family or the church, to teach the man how to use the freedom. The state's role is merely to recognize it. So this is the primary contention with identity politics. Identity politics fails to treat the state for what it is. By trying to use the state to enforce a particular way of life through identity politics, the alt-right think they are advocating for virtue, or at least what they consider to be virtuous, when they are really advocating for power. And virtue and power are not the same thing. In fact, virtue often means relinquishing power. So those who defend Western civilization will have to choose. Where do they put their trust? In the alt-right's crown of power, represented by identity politics, or in the crown of thorns represented by liberalism? I've made my choice, and I reaffirm it with a quote from that first liberalist: "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, render to God what is God's."